But what this game could probably benefit from is actually a Nintendo Switch Pro. So we're going to move on and discuss the Nintendo Switch Pro rumors that I have right here. Right here. Yes, so I have this IGN article up here by Matt TM Kim again. This guy is popping off on IGN. Go Matt. You must be a freelancer and trying to... Maybe, I don't know who this guy is. He's certainly not one of the four... the people who are on the podcast. A lot of the... Maybe he is. I don't know. I don't listen to other podcasts. But the last podcast, we read 2 of his articles, so maybe we'll read a second one. Maybe I should put that in the end of the podcast. Yep, we'll figure it out. Anyways, since the Nintendo Switch came out, there have been rumors of a Nintendo Switch Pro model. But of recent weeks and almost months now, there's been new rumors coming up. Matt Kim has brought together all these industry experts who have their eyes set on forecasting this Nintendo Switch Pro. Essentially, the rumors go is that Nintendo is planning to make a Nintendo Switch Pro model, which will have an OLED screen, 720p resolution, however, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of. And it'll be, I believe, 7 inches, and I believe the Switch is 6.2 inches, if I'm not mistaken. It'll essentially get rid of the bezels on the Switch, which is cool. And it will be able to output 4K resolution, which I think is technically already within. And if I'm not mistaken, it will be able to use the same dock. So I think that's the goal. I think the goal is to use the USB-C technology to output 4K resolution. Does that mean Nintendo Switch games will be coming out in 4K? I don't think so. So if we take a look at Nintendo's history with iterative consoles, there's really only one example, and I think it's the new 3DS. The new 3DS and new 3DS XL were released about halfway through the 3DS life cycle. It was in order to place a nub, which sort of acted, like the laptop nub that you would have in the middle of your keyboard. It essentially functioned the same way, and it was to add that as a right analog stick. It was used in very few games, and they released one game that was exclusive to it. Xenoblade Chronicles. I think it was only one game they released. Xenoblade Chronicles on Switch, which was a cool update to that game, but of course, not on Switch, sorry, on new 3DS, but then they released it on Switch, is why I said that. So, which is obviously the definitive edition of that game, because you can play it in HD. So I would say that I think if they could figure out a way to scale these games up to 4K and output them in 4K, that would be pretty cool. But obviously it's possible. When you buy a game on Steam on your PC, you can play it at 720p, you can play it whatever resolution you want. Does that mean that it's going to have better textures or anything? Better graphic textures? Like high, mid, low graphic settings? I don't think so. I think just having the capability of outputting in 4K is a pretty cool thing. That's essentially the rumor here. But we can go dive into here some more rumors. 4K support doesn't necessarily mean that the games will look good in 4K. If they're still making all the games to be played on Switch, like you see it yourself, right? If you play some of the games, like for instance Witcher 3, right? This is my example. Witcher 3 is on Switch. I think it runs at like 540p on, or 5, I think it's 540 or 6, whatever the step below 720 is, on in handheld docked mode, right? I got it. It's a fun game, obviously. It's Witcher 3. I wanted to play it. I like the idea of being able to take it on the go because I don't have time to play it at home. So I got pretty far in the game. I never beat it. I'm never going to beat that game. But it functioned all right. It was like it dropped frames. It wasn't that hot resolution-wise, and you didn't really notice it too much. Obviously, if you're coming from PC, you're gonna notice it. If you're coming from even PS4, you're gonna notice it. But I still chugged along. You could see that there were texture pop-ins all the time, and a lot of the enemies lacked textures. But the game functioned on handheld mode. But if you put it on dock mode, you would run at 720p, I believe, on the screen, on the big old screen. And then you noticed, oh, if you just increase the size of the picture, you start noticing the textures look really bad. So it was just not the way. Obviously it's not the most optimal way to play Witcher 3. That would be on PC. But if that's the level of games that are going to be put out on Switch, because they're going, I assume the Switch Pro is just going to play Switch games. They're not going to be doing things like they did with the new Nintendo Switch, new Nintendo 3DS. They're not going to be doing things like that, where they release a game exclusively for it. I think they're just going to try to release a game that plays on all the Switch consoles, which would be 3 at this point. And similar to how Xbox is releasing games. I don't think that these games are going to be scaled in terms of graphical fidelity or things like that just because Nintendo put a new processor in there. I think being able to output at 4K resolution is cool, but it might not necessarily bode so well for something like Witcher 3, which was barely working on Nintendo Switch. I'm not saying that Witcher 3 is the de facto example of how games can look on Nintendo Switch. Obviously, it was downscaled so much to fit on Nintendo Switch. But if you take a look at Breath of the Wild, for instance, or Mario Odyssey, you have a game made specifically for Nintendo Switch that looks amazing because of the art style and because the developers making those games had so much time with the Switch and put a lot of care into making it run perfectly on Switch. So seeing Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild on Switch in 4K would be really cool. I think those games would definitely hold up because they were designed properly for Switch. So moving forward, if we do see things like that, obviously Breath of the Wild 2 is coming out, Metroid Prime 4, maybe some other Nintendo exclusive, the new Pokemon game, Pokemon Arceus. Those games will benefit from running on Nintendo Switch Pro. I think that if they can put a processor out into this thing that will provide the Switch with a constant frame rate, that would be amazing. I don't think it's going to be running at 60 frames per second, which would be, oh my god. If they could get these games running at 60 FPS, that would be amazing. But if if they could just lock down 30 frames per second on Switch in handheld mode, that would be really great. I think that the game does struggle a lot with graphical stutters. Even in new games like Bravely Default 2, I see frame rate stutters all the time, and it's quite annoying, especially when you're doing a function in the game that's built into the game, multiply the speed by 4 times in the battle. That's especially when you see a lot of graphical stutters in that game. It's not anything, it's a turn-based RPG, it doesn't actually matter, but it is alarming to see the Switch moving forward at this rate. So I'd like to talk just pricing. I think the only way they're going to be able to sell this is probably at $300. I don't think anyone would want to buy a Switch above that price, unless they're like me, and I would buy a Switch Pro at $400. But if they are the same price as the PS5 and the Xbox Series X, then it's not going to look good for them. So I think that the next thing that they also need to add is Bluetooth. Bluetooth would be a really fantastic feature for both docked mode and of course handheld mode, which is what I really want it for. I think the handheld mode is in dire need of Bluetooth. I mean, if you just even look back to the PlayStation Vita, something that came out in 2011, I believe, 10 years ago, it had Bluetooth in it. It had an OLED screen. So that's the type of foresight that Sony had when making the Vita that Nintendo just refuses to put into their system. So hopefully we do get an OLED screen, because that would make colors much more vibrant. Hopefully we do get a new processor that can output 4K and also lock down a solid frame rate for these games, and hopefully we get Bluetooth in these types of things, and hopefully we also get a larger screen. I could see all those things benefiting Nintendo Switch, and hopefully we get a $300-350 price point. I think that would be a game changer for Switch, and it would extend the life cycle of the Nintendo Switch probably another 3 or 4 years on top of whatever it's going to be. So that's my 2 cents on the Nintendo Switch Pro. I hope things work out for them.